few days ago, I was listening to an interview on Radio 4 with Mo Gawdat, an engineer who has come up with an equation for happiness. He described how he had explored many self-help books in the past that purport to show you how to experience greater peace, contentment, or control in your life, but he felt he couldn't relate to any of them. Through many difficulties in his own life, including the death of his son during an operation in his early 20s, he came up with this equation, the happiness equation, and he felt that this made sense to him. It goes like this. Your happiness is equal to or greater than your perception of the events of your life minus your expectations of how life should behave. Your happiness is equal to or greater than your perception of the events of your life minus your expectations of how life should behave. To illustrate what he means, he gave the example of ordering a takeaway. You can open up your takeaway and enjoy it because you haven't had to cook it, or because you've chosen something that you wouldn't normally prepare for yourself, and the whole experience can be extremely satisfying. It can give you a sense of happiness. You can be pleased with the way this meal event has turned out. Or you can find the experience quite the opposite. Perhaps you've ordered a takeaway, but you're thinking to yourself, I shouldn't be eating this at home. I should be out enjoying an evening with my friends. You could have ordered a takeaway from the most gourmet of restaurants, but your mindset dictates that you will be disappointed. Gawdat says that this disappointment comes because your brain is telling you lies. In the current lockdown situation, it is not possible to go out with your friends or to enjoy a meal out with them or in one another's homes. If you listen to the lie your brain is telling you, that you should be expecting this impossibility, then you will be an unhappy person. So he talks about managing expectations and challenging your brain when it tells you that things are not as they really are. For example, he was asked by the interviewer about how this works in the context of the death of his son. Gawdat said that after his son died, his brain was telling him to blame the surgeon. He's done a terrible thing, go after him and wreak revenge. But he was able to challenge this way of thinking. He said that he had to realise that this was a lie, that the truth is that no surgeon gets up in the morning and decides he's going to kill someone today. A terrible thing had happened, but giving ear to the voice of bitterness, resentment and vengeance that was telling him lies would not bring his son back or help him deal with his grief. When Gawdat was speaking, I thought about a recent way in which I had done that. I had adjusted my thinking without even realising it. Earlier this month, I had my first lockdown birthday, and a few people made comments about making the best of it in the current circumstances. But I'd already decided that I wasn't going to think about what I might have done on my birthday in previous years. I had a lovely day at home, and I enjoyed everything that happened. I had no unrealistic expectations of anything different happening, and I had a fabulous day. It also made me think about church life. I do hear from people who are very discontented with the current lockdown situation and who are very unhappy that congregations can't meet in the normal way. Whatever we do to try and enable worship and fellowship and togetherness might be criticised because it doesn't match what we think things should be like. Zoom services, printed service at home sheets and phone calls will never be good enough if they're always measured against what we used to do. If we accept that for safety reasons and for the good of one another there are things that we can't do at the moment, then perhaps we can learn to feel more positive about the alternatives. And perhaps that will make us happier to live in this in-between time. And perhaps we will be able to find some contentment here. I often return to the phrase, bloom where you're planted. And I often say to myself and to God, well, this is the situation I'm in. How can I grow here? How can I flourish here? How can I see this as a time for learning rather than just a time to get through as quickly as possible? I know that much of this happiness equation does make sense, that if our expectations of how things should be are much higher than the reality, then we will always be disappointed. But the downside to this is that you might stop expecting anything. The logical conclusion is that you will be a happier person if you're always expecting the worst, because hopefully at least some of the time things will end up being better than you thought. And I'm not sure I want to live like that. There seems to be a lot of negativity in the world, and I don't want to add to it by always looking for the worst case scenario. And I'm challenged because my faith tells me that there are good things to hope for. As a Christian, I'm called to live in hope, and I'm challenged not to accept the realities of life in their entirety. There are some things, of course, that are part of life's natural processes, like feeling pain when difficult things happen, or experiencing illness, or facing death. But there are other things that are worth questioning. There are plenty of times when we should be raising our expectations and challenging those in power to do the same. For example, some governments may seem to accept that food banks are necessary, that some people will always be homeless, that it's okay that the majority of people needing state benefits are actually in work but are not paid enough to make ends meet, that the climate crisis must take a back seat compared to the economic and employment crisis. And I've spoken to many people who believe that these things are true. What can you do about them? That's just the way life is, they might say. And people think I'm a bit odd if I say that I think food banks are a bad thing. After all, lots of churches are heavily invested in running these things. But my point is that we should be addressing the cause as well as trying to stick a plaster on the symptoms. I don't want to accept that we live in this wealthy country, yet it is normal for a good number of people to be unable to afford to feed themselves or their families. Yes, we need to help these people, of course, but surely we've got to challenge the whole system that has such a level of unfairness built into it. And yes, I'm on the case of capitalism again. I think we can do better. I don't want to live in a world where happiness and value are measured in terms of productivity and economic usefulness. I don't want to live in a world where somehow the rich keep getting richer and the poverty gap increasingly widens and the poor get poorer and nobody notices or speaks up about it. I recently came across something that said, when you understand that under capitalism a forest has no value until it's cut down, you begin to understand the root of our ecological crisis. I don't want to live in a world where this is the case, and this is the currency we trade in, economic profit over ecological benefit. I have higher expectations than this. And it is disappointing and frustrating that there is such a gap here between my expectation and the reality, and it makes me angry and uncomfortable and extremely unhappy. And the answer to my happiness problem is not to lower my expectations and to accept the status quo, but rather to do whatever I can to change the reality. Jesus always put people first. He showed us that there is a special place in God's heart for the poor, the powerless, the victimised and the excluded. And he told us that we will be judged on how we treat others, because whatever we do for the poor, the powerless, the victimised and the excluded, whether that's something positive or negative, we are doing it to him. Jesus is using a food bank today. Jesus lives in a part of the world where natural resources are exploited for our Western consumption. Jesus sleeps on the streets and we walk past him. Jesus is working 2 jobs, yet still can't afford the cost of living. And what are we doing about it? What are we doing about the causes and not just the symptoms? For Jesus, it was people first, all the time. People over profit, people over religious practices, people over systems of production and rule. And I think that's probably where true happiness lies, in reaching out to discover those human connections, in doing whatever we're doing, not for our own good, but for the well-being of somebody else. I want to be happy today. I can find plenty of hobbies to do that will give me a lot of enjoyment, or I can take a realistic look at what's possible and achievable and match my expectations to it. But I know I will find the greatest happiness in reaching out to someone else and doing something good for them. And if we all focused all our energy into doing that, can you imagine what a happy world we might live in.